Hey guys, tonight we stand at the lip of a kiln yard, watching heat blur the air like a mirage over river stones. You lift a chipped cup that was once whole. The clay smells faintly of wet earth and old smoke. A thin thread of sunlight slips across a green glaze, and for a brief, quiet moment the world reduces to that single color. You probably won't survive this without wanting another cup of tea. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The yard smells like iron and grass. You will hear small human things, a wheel's sigh, a master's quiet instruction, the sound of tea poured into thin porcelain. You step forward into that softened light. The kiln's mouth is a dark, patient eye. Embers breathe inside with low, steady motion. Clay dust hangs like suspended pollen. Tools rest on benches as if sleeping, wooden ribs, soft brushes, thin metal needles for inlay, a block of carved wood used to dry press lids. Each tool has a name and a small story. The old scraper is called the patient thumb because it remembers every curve it once corrected. A clear historical anchor shapes what you see. Korean celadon reached its most refined forms during the Goryeo dynasty, roughly the 10th through 14th centuries, when potters refined reduction techniques and iron-sourced glazes to reach that pale jade green. That fact is a tidy map. The lived map is the slow repetition of wedges of time, mixing, throwing, scraping, inlaying, glazing, tending the fire, and waiting. The apprentice centers clay with a concentration that makes you hold your breath. His hands are careful and a little proud. The master watches the curve form and then gives a single small correction. You notice how touch carries instruction. Skills transmit more by the weight of hand than by language. You feel a little jealous of the apprenticeship model. It promises long horizons and slow, public improvement. One joke slips in: if you take a pottery class online, you'll learn 3 great things: how to make a bowl that looks like a satellite dish, how to caption your failures optimistically, and how to blame the kiln for everything. You grin because the self-deprecation is honest. Fringe practices mingle with careful technique. Some workshops once staged moonlight exposures of certain pieces, convinced that lunar light coaxed subtleties in the glaze. Others briefly buried wear in coarse salt, convinced it would nudge a sharper sheen. These rituals sit between experiment and story. They are not lab protocols. They are small human ways of trying to tilt luck toward beauty. You like these oddities because they make the yard feel inhabited by belief as well as skill. Glaze mixing is almost ceremonial. The potter sifts ash and clay, tests with a small fired chip, and trusts decades of embodied judgment. He does not consult a digital scale. He measures by hand memory. He speaks of reduction firing like a cook speaks of a long-simmered broth. Inside the kiln, oxygen will be starved at certain moments to change the chemistry and pull green tones from iron-bearing glazes. The control is subtle and exact. A technical mainstream note: reduction firing changes the oxidation state of iron in the glaze, and that directly influences final color. The kiln is an instrument tuned by patience. Tea arrives on a low tray. The cup is thin and warm. You sit. Tea cuts dust like a clear note. Tea breaks are midday islands where gossip and technique trade. An old potter tells a story about a cracked bowl sold to a monk who treasured the fissure as a map. The irony sits like a fine crack in glaze. What counts as flaw is sometimes what converts a thing into a story. Another joke lands soft: the market will buy anything if you can pair it with a wistful backstory. The potters shrug and laugh because they have seen it work. Historians still argue whether certain aesthetic and technical choices in Korean celadon were primarily influenced by Song dynasty China or whether local materials, pragmatic innovation, and aesthetic preference produced an independent Korean trajectory. That phrasing appears in papers and labels and sometimes feels remote, but it matters in how institutions tell the story. For you standing by the kiln, the debate translates into layers, choices of clay, ash, furnace, atmosphere, and a set of hands that learned by doing. You are allowed to handle one piece. The bisque is cool and faintly chalky. Your fingertip leaves the slightest trace. The tactile memory of that touch lingers as if recorded into the clay's next sentence. Later, when glaze melts and surface tension smooths everything, the piece will gain its final voice. For now, texture and weight are the language through which potters speak. Outside the yard, the river moves like an old seam, patient and certain. A heron stalks along the bank like a thin conductor. The village rhythm holds workshops, market days, and tea breaks in gentle alignment. A woman with a basket passes and nods in the manner of practical blessing. Small economies make the day intimate. Sound is the yard's secret language. The wheel hums. The kiln exhales. Birds quarrel by the bank. A dog naps and twitches as if chasing a shape only it can see. You run a fingertip along the rim of the bisque piece. It feels like thick paper. You are allowed to handle it because shared attention is part of the craft. The master watches not to correct, but to welcome you into practice. You imagine the kiln as a living instrument to be tuned, charcoal, bellows, timing, and the master's patience combine to form an atmosphere that can turn earth into glass. When the bellows pull and oxygen shifts, iron in the glaze will change its valence and nudge color by degrees. You think of that slow chemical conversation and feel oddly soothed. Later the kiln will demand honesty, for now the yard breathes and the day narrows to careful, exact tasks. You sit with tea, with a shard, and with the soft conviction that making patience visible is a kind of generosity. You breathe with the yard and feel your shoulders loosen. The bellows will be opened, the kiln will demand both attention and surrender, and you will follow with steady, slow breathing. One last joke: if pottery awarded loyalty points, you'd be halfway to a free teacup. You return to the wheel with a sense of quiet triumph, but the workshop is already humming with the next cycle of work. Clay waits like a patient audience, and the wheel spins under your fingers as though testing your attentiveness. You shape a simple bowl, focusing on symmetry and the gentle curve of the rim, each motion a lesson in rhythm. Historical context surfaces. Goryeo potters prized proportion and restraint, believing a well-balanced vessel harmonized with human use and aesthetic ideals. The philosophy is subtle, form itself carries virtue. You watch the way light catches the damp clay. Fingerprints, small imperfections and slight asymmetries transform under a glaze. A fringe observation enters. Some workshops intentionally left micro flaws to reflect the unpredictability of life and to honor the hand of the maker. The practice is controversial but enduring. You experiment with controlled irregularities, aware that scholars still argue whether these touches were deliberate aesthetic statements or incidental results later praised as intentional. Technique matters. You trim excess clay from the base, compressing the surface to prevent cracking during firing. You learn to read the body's moisture. Too wet and it warps, too dry and it flakes. Every touch is measured. The wheel's resistance teaches subtle pressure, and you respond instinctively. Observing a master's hand helps calibrate your own, as if a silent mentor whispers guidance into your fingertips. A small joke: the wheel is a cruel teacher that never grades on curve but always on commitment. The workshop's hierarchy continues to shape the day. Apprentices rotate through duties, kneading fresh clay, preparing slip, polishing ribs, or tending the kiln. Each task may seem mundane, but holds embedded lessons. The repetition develops muscle memory and precision. You notice how even trivial activities, like stacking shards for drying, become practice in weight, balance, and care. A joke mishandling shards can inspire more profound humility than any lecture on chemistry. Sangam inlay becomes a mental exercise. You draw motifs in the air before touching clay, imagining how paste will settle, how glaze will flow, and how firing might subtly shift color. The historical tradition is clear. Goryeo artisans developed intricate inlay patterns for symbolic and ritual purposes, often reflecting lotus flowers, cranes, and clouds. Each motif carries both aesthetic and cultural weight. You appreciate that learning the gesture is as important as completing it. Tea breaks punctuate the day. You sip and observe, noting subtle changes in kiln smoke, ambient temperature, and apprentice behavior. Tea here is both reset and calibration, offering a pause to reflect on minute corrections. Fringe practices linger in memory. Some masters once whispered secrets of inlay preparation during tea, embedding knowledge within ritualized conversation. You recall these as instructive curiosities, not essential truths, but they enrich the texture of learning. You notice the kiln's afterglow or residual heat that continues to alter clay subtly. You handle a piece, noting how small cracks form in predictable patterns and how glaze sheen shifts with lingering warmth. Practical knowledge accumulates, timing the opening of the kiln matters to color, to surface tension, and to structural integrity. This is less about theory and more about experience. Historians still argue whether the art of waiting in firing had codified rules or remained an intuitive practice across workshops. Market considerations drift into thought. Even at the wheel, you think about who will handle this bowl, how it will be packed, and whether its shape or motif will appeal to a local merchant, a palace inspector, or a distant buyer. Every hand market preference and transport choice folds into the act of making. You joke softly. The wheel turns, but the world outside is the real kiln. Humor keeps anxiety manageable. Work requires negotiation between control and surrender. The wheel obeys pressure and speed, but clay has its own tendencies. You anticipate bulges, compensate for uneven moisture, and sometimes embrace accidental curves that add character. Those subtle allowances mirror historical debates about perfection versus natural variation in celadon. The fringe idea appears again. Imperfection may be intentional, celebrating the unpredictability of kiln chemistry and human touch. You pause to examine a test tile. The iron content in glaze produces a green that shifts subtly under light. You recall prior kiln experiments and note incremental adjustments. Every firing becomes a mini science experiment, with observation and subtle modification building long-term expertise. You understand why experienced masters read tiles as if reading a musical score. Each tile is evidence, instruction, and inspiration. Evening falls, stretching shadows across the workshop. You handle the last few pieces for the day, smoothing edges and noting potential firing issues. The rhythm slows, hands tire, but the mind remains alert. A joke surfaces when clay protests. Only a laugh and gentle persistence will coax it into submission. Another joke, apprentices secretly hope mischief in glaze will be excused as creative interpretation. The humor is soft, bonding the team and easing tension. At day's end, you line up the bowls for drying. You touch each, appreciating curves and weight. They carry traces of your hands and the accumulated knowledge of decades of masters. A fringe detail, some old workshops embedded tiny marks, invisible to buyers, as signatures or to honor tradition. You ponder whether small gestures matter more than you realize. They embed narrative in material, turning functional objects into cultural documents. Finally, you step away from the wheel, listening to the workshop exhale. The kiln waits, the teapot cools, and apprentices chat in soft, rhythmic tones. You feel the quiet satisfaction of a day completed, technical skills reinforced, and traditions honored. Your hands bear the memory of clay, water, and fire. Your mind catalogues techniques, stories, and rituals ready for tomorrow's session. You step into the yard just as morning dew coats the kiln bricks with a transient silver gloss. The air smells of damp earth and faint smoke from last night's firing. The master signals you to follow him to the storage racks where test tiles and partially dried wares wait. You carry a small bundle of new slips for inlay. Each step across the yard is deliberate. You notice the sounds: a bird flits, the faint creak of kiln doors cooling, and the soft scrape of a broom against stone. These details are quiet lessons in attention. The workshop maintains an archive of failed and successful tiles. Historical point: Goryeo potters meticulously recorded kiln conditions, glaze formulas, and firing sequences, enabling both refinement and replication. You inspect a small tile marked with a sequence of dates and temperature notes. French practice: some families wrote personal messages under test tiles for posterity or luck. You wonder whether those notes influenced success or merely amused future apprentices. Scholars still argue whether these annotations had practical value or were purely superstitious. You knead clay for a new set of bowls. Fingers sink into the pliable body, feeling resistance, moisture, and texture. Apprenticeship continues through repetition. You learn how small variations in pressure and speed affect shape. Master occasionally gestures, correcting posture, hand angle, or thumb placement. It's intimate, almost imperceptible guidance. Joke: the clay knows your weakness before you do. Another joke: if your hands could talk, they'd file complaints daily. Inlay sketches are drawn freehand before touching clay. You plan motifs that reference lotus petals and crane flights, incorporating subtle asymmetry to test your precision. Technique requires visualization of negative space, the depth of grooves, and pace application. Fringe: older masters occasionally instructed students to whisper to the clay to steady hands. The ritual feels strange but becomes meditative. Your rhythm deepens as water, slip, and wheel combine into a flow that is both technical and calming. A practical lesson arrives with firing tests. You check parametric cones and note their soft bend as temperature rises. Knowledge accumulates incrementally, too rapid a rise, and the glaze may crack too slow, and the desired jade hue fails. You record observations mentally and in small ledger. Humor softens the rigors. The kiln is the strictest teacher. Ignore it and learn humility. Another joke: if clay could sigh, it would at your mistakes. Apprenticeship is social as well as tactile. You watch as a senior shows a junior how to scrape excess paste, demonstrating pressure and angle. The trainee replicates, then corrects under supervision. Knowledge flows horizontally and vertically. The ritual of observation and repetition is essential. Skill cannot be rushed. Historians still argue how much creative freedom apprentices had under strict guild structures, balancing innovation against conformity. Tea arrives mid-morning. Steam curls and fills the yard with warmth. You sip, letting the ritual calm your senses. Sensory layering is subtle. Taste, smell, and sound intersect. Conversations slide from kiln techniques to personal anecdotes. Fringe stories surface. One apprentice claims a particular pine ash makes lotus petals sing under glaze. Another swears by moonlight exposure before trimming. You appreciate both technical and whimsical layers. You prepare the kiln for the next firing cycle. Airflow, fuel load, and placement of wares are coordinated like an orchestra. The kiln is temperamental, Slight miscalculations can produce uneven color or cracked bodies. Joke, the kiln has a mind of its own and a sense of humor. Another joke, patience is its payment, impatience its punishment. Fringe tale, a potter once added a sprig of juniper for luck, claiming it saved an entire batch. Social economy intersects with craft. Orders arrive for palace quality wares and market sets. Each demands careful sorting, handling, and firing strategy. Apprentices learn to triage which pieces will undergo experimental glaze, which will follow traditional formulas. These choices reflect both technical mastery and understanding of social networks of trade. You appreciate that pottery extends beyond the wheel to cultural negotiation. Daylight wanes. You examine pieces for balance, glaze coverage, and texture. Hands are tired but precise. Patterns emerge, mistakes noted, triumphs celebrated quietly. Apprentices gather tiles for drying racks and catalogue their outcomes. Master supervises, noting subtle differences. You internalize that observation is as critical as manual skill. A moment's inattention can ripple through an entire firing cycle. Joke, the kiln remembers every error. Evening conversation drifts toward ritual motifs. You discuss the symbolic meaning of cranes, lotuses, and clouds, revisiting prior work. The master notes that subtle deviations communicate layers of meaning only perceptible to a trained eye. Fringe, whispered tales suggest certain motifs were designed to invoke luck in commerce. You smile, the line between aesthetics, superstition, and social messaging blurs. Scholars still debate the extent to which symbolic content dictated workshop choices versus being aesthetic afterthought. By the day's end, you set tools in order, sweep the yard, and check moisture levels of clay. The kiln cools, and the yard settles into soft quiet. You sip the last of your tea, reflecting on the day's rhythm of creation, correction, and ritual. There is satisfaction in the continuity, a knowledge that your hands carry lessons from generations past. Humor, ritual, and labor have all contributed to the slow weaving of skill and meaning that defines the craft. You rise before dawn to catch the soft light spilling across the workshop's roof tiles. Mist coils in the yard like a lazy ribbon. The kiln, now cold, seems almost inert, yet your memory of its heat lingers. You approach the wheel with quiet deliberation, each movement measured. Historical point, celadon artisans often began work early to align moisture in clay and humidity in the yard with optimal shaping conditions. You inhale the faint scent of dried ash and earth, knowing it is a signal to focus, not rush. Clay preparation is ritualistic. You wedge, knead, and test elasticity. Hands remember prior firings, anticipating resistance and pliability. Fringe practice, some masters chant softly while wedging, claiming rhythm enhances attention. You hum internally, acknowledging the oddity while benefiting from its meditative cadence. Scholars still argue whether such rituals had practical influence on clay behavior or were entirely symbolic gestures to focus the mind. A sequence of bowls awaits trimming. The master demonstrates pressure, rotation, and timing. You mimic, sometimes perfectly, sometimes flawed. Corrections are minimal but precise, guiding without overshadowing. The philosophy of repetition is clear, skill accumulates in small increments. Joke, the wheel punishes impatience but rewards persistence. Joke 2, clay has no patience for chatter. Joke 3, even tea cannot fix a warped rim. The humor keeps tension manageable. You prepare slip for delicate inlay work. Patterns are drawn with meticulous care, often referencing classical motifs. Lotus flowers, cranes, and clouds dominate. Historical note, these motifs were both aesthetic and symbolic, intended for domestic, ritual, or diplomatic use. You test paste viscosity, noting how it will settle into fine grooves during firing. Fringe insight: some families believed whispering intentions into the paste could influence color. You smile at superstition but respect its cultural persistence. Midday tea arrives. You sip slowly, letting taste and aroma recalibrate focus. The air is filled with faint smoke from neighboring kilns. Conversations turn to kiln behavior, moisture variations, and prior successes. Observations are layered. Temperature, color, and tactile feedback all feed into decision making. Tea facilitates this, offering pause for reflection. Historians still argue whether artisan tea rituals were purely social or an essential part of workflow calibration. The kiln's upcoming firing demands careful staging. You check pyrometric cones, arrange wares, and measure fuel. Each adjustment shapes outcomes, minor tweaks affect color, texture, and glaze depth. Fringe story: some potters added herbal sprigs to late-stage fires to influence glaze sheen. You prepare as though the kiln were both partner and puzzle, anticipating subtle chemical reactions. Master approves placement, nodding silently. Apprentices rotate duties efficiently. Some carry water to clay, others prepare lids, while a few trim small vessels. You notice that repetition and observation reinforce muscle memory. Social learning intertwines with technical precision. Joke: the kiln has its favorites. Joke 2: water is a better teacher than any lecture. Joke 3: lids demand respect or rebellion ensues. Humor mediates the intensity of labor. You examine drying ware under diffused light, noting uneven moisture spots and minor warping. Adjustments are subtle tweaking positions, airflow, and handling. Historical relevance: attention to drying conditions was critical to prevent kiln damage and preserve glaze integrity. Fringe practices: certain masters rotated pieces to align with moonlight, believing celestial energy influenced clay stability. Scholars still debate the effectiveness of these practices. The afternoon is dedicated to teaching younger apprentices the intricacies of carving slip and inserting delicate designs. The process demands steady hands, patience, and careful timing. You supervise, correcting posture and angles subtly. Each demonstration reinforces the workshop's knowledge network. Humor and small jokes lighten tension. Too much paste and your crane will swim away, someone quips, eliciting soft laughter. Toward evening, the kiln is prepared for firing. Wood is measured, vents adjusted, and airflows tested. Every decision affects the transformation from damp clay to glassy green perfection. You observe as the master manipulates bellows, guiding flames and smoke. Historical note: control of the reduction atmosphere was essential to achieve the signature celadon jade tone. Fringe observation: old stories suggest that some potters recited poems to predict firing success, blending craft and narrative intuition. As light fades, apprentices inspect results from previous firings. Minor faults are catalogued, success is celebrated quietly. Patterns emerge across batches, informing future adjustments. You reflect on the accumulation of small insights, technical intuition, and ritualized observation that forms the backbone of the workshop's knowledge. The day closes with soft chatter, sweeping of floors, and the slow settling of hands into remembered rhythm. You step into the yard as dusk paints the sky with a soft copper hue. Shadows stretch long over racks of drying ware, and the smell of faint kiln smoke mixes with earth and lingering tea aromas. Historical note: Korean workshops often scheduled their most delicate operations in transitional light, believing subtle variations in daylight revealed imperfections. You adjust your eyes to notice tiny cracks, glaze unevenness, and asymmetries in the bowls and plates before you. Fringe insight: some potters whispered instructions to clay at dusk, claiming it responded better to human attention under soft light. Scholars still debate whether these were symbolic or merely reflective of mindfulness practices. Hands move over clay like instruments. You trim, smooth, and compress, each touch informed by countless repetitions and corrections. The master circulates silently, observing, occasionally nodding. You note that repetition is less about perfection than about muscle memory and intuitive judgment. Joke 1, clay never forgives laziness. Joke 2, lids have an attitude problem. Joke 3, the wheel is a cruel friend that always remembers your mistakes. Humor lubricates the intensity of work, making long hours feel lighter. Inlay work proceeds with delicate precision. You outline motifs in lotus petals, clouds, and cranes, tracing imaginary lines in the air before touching clay. You dip the paste, adjust viscosity, and insert it carefully into grooves. Each movement carries both aesthetic and practical weight. Historical point inlaid celadon was highly prized for both domestic use and diplomatic gifts, demonstrating mastery over materials and symbolism. Fringe stories abound. Some apprentices claimed that whispering intentions while inlaying improved glaze color. You indulge the superstition, noticing how it slows your hands and sharpens focus. Midday tea has become a measured rhythm. You sip while observing kiln smoke, apprentice movements, and drying wear. Conversations mix technical discussion with gossip and small jokes. Observations inform decisions, moisture levels, glaze consistency, and upcoming firing timing are all weighed against sensory input. Humor keeps energy light. Someone quips, the kiln is the strictest teacher, but tea is its forgiving friend. Tea becomes both social and operational calibration, resetting your senses. The kiln awaits preparation. You monitor air vents, fuel levels, and placement of pieces. Subtle adjustments dictate outcome, temperature, reduction atmosphere, and wood type influence the jade hue and translucency of celadon. Historical fact, Goryeo masters manipulated reduction conditions to achieve signature green tones. Fringe detail, families occasionally placed sprigs of juniper or pine during late-stage firing for luck or slight chemical influence. You watch the fire and anticipate its shifts, acknowledging both science and ritual. Apprentices rotate duties efficiently, each learning micro skills. You oversee trimming, slip carving, and small corrections. Observation is key. Tiny mistakes affect firing outcomes. The social hierarchy ensures knowledge flows both vertically and laterally. Joke 1, water teaches more than lectures. Joke 2, lids are temperamental. Joke 3, misaligned tiles will haunt your dreams. Humor keeps repetitive tasks engaging while reinforcing lessons. You inspect drying wear under fading light, noting warping, moisture inconsistencies, and minor imperfections. Adjustments are subtle rotation, repositioning, and careful handling. Historical point, controlled drying prevented cracking and ensured glaze integrity. Fringe practices, some masters rotated pieces according to lunar phases, claiming celestial influence on drying and firing. Scholars debate whether such practices were effective or merely ritualized mindfulness. Teaching younger apprentices is a constant rhythm. You demonstrate carving, inlay, and trimming techniques, emphasizing posture, angle, and timing. Each session embeds knowledge into muscle memory and tacit understanding. Humor and small jokes of too much paste and your crane will swim away, lighten instruction, and build rapport. The process is patient, precise, and deliberate. The kiln is prepared for evening firing. Wood is arranged, bellows checked, and airflow optimized. Small changes in placement and timing affect glaze reaction, body shrinkage, and final hue. Historical point, reduction atmospheres were carefully controlled to produce jade tones. Fringe note, Poetic recitations sometimes accompanied firing, blending craft with narrative ritual. You sense the kiln as both partner and puzzle, responding to subtle human adjustments. Evening inspections conclude the day. Minor faults are catalogued, successes celebrated quietly. Patterns across batches inform future firing adjustments. You note the accumulation of practical knowledge, intuition, and ritualized observation forming the workshop's expertise. The day closes with sweeping, soft conversation, and settling hands into remembered rhythm. Humor, ritual, and labor weave a tapestry of craft, continuity, and quiet satisfaction. Night falls gently over the kiln yard, wrapping bricks and drying racks in a cool hush. You move deliberately, feeling the residual warmth of the day seep into stone and clay. Historical fact, nocturnal inspection was sometimes practiced to monitor moisture, temperature, and glaze development under soft moonlight, which revealed subtle defects unseen in harsher daylight. Fringe practice. Some potters believed that speaking quietly to the kiln at night encouraged even firing. Scholars still argue whether such rituals had practical effect or were symbolic reminders to remain attentive. You examine freshly fired pieces, noting subtle color shifts and surface textures. Each bowl, cup, or plate carries a story of water, clay, and human touch. Hands glide over rims, pressing lightly to detect warping. The master watches silently, offering occasional gestures for correction. You sense that the night heightens observation. Joke 1, clay knows your mistakes and waits for darkness to remind you. Joke 2, lids have more opinions at night. Joke 3, the kiln is a temperamental friend that only whispers. Humor maintains alertness and morale. Inlay work continues for those pieces destined for special orders. You insert fine paste into carved grooves, paying attention to thickness, pressure, and motif integrity. Lotus petals and crane feathers take shape with each careful insertion. Historical note: inlay design often conveyed symbolic meaning in both domestic and diplomatic contexts. Fringe story: whispering intentions while inlaying was believed to influence final glaze color. You adopt the rhythm, aware that focus and calm hands dictate outcome more than superstition. Tea breaks occur in the dim light, offering pause and reflection. Steam curls, carrying scent and warmth. Conversations touch on technical adjustments, subtle kiln variations, and gossip. Observing kiln smoke, ambient temperature, and apprentice behavior provides indirect instruction. Humor threads through dialogue. The kiln's judgment is merciless, but tea is forgiving, someone quips. Tea becomes calibration, social cohesion, and a gentle counterpoint to labor intensity. Kiln preparation intensifies. Airflow, wood arrangement, and piece placement are adjusted with care. Minor changes influence temperature distribution and glaze reaction. Historical fact: careful reduction control allowed celadon to achieve its characteristic jade hue. Fringe practice: sprigs of juniper or pine sometimes accompanied firing, blending superstition and subtle chemical impact. You monitor flames, smoke, and amber behavior, sensing the kiln as partner and puzzle. Apprentices rotate through tasks, trimming, carving, slip application, and kiln tending. Observation and repetition reinforce skill, while hierarchy ensures knowledge flows across experience levels. Joke 1, water teaches better than any lecture. Joke 2, lids require respect or rebellion. Joke 3, misaligned tiles will haunt your dreams. Humor softens the rigor, builds camaraderie, and reinforces learning. Inspection of drying ware under moonlight reveals moisture differences and warping. Adjustments, rotation, repositioning, gentle handling prevent damage during firing. Historical note: proper drying prevented cracking and maintained glaze quality. Fringe practice: Lunar rotation of pieces was sometimes employed to harmonize with celestial rhythms. Scholars debate whether such methods were effective or symbolic, but they contributed to attentive workflow. Teaching apprentices continues with deliberate demonstration. You show carving, inlay, and trimming techniques emphasizing posture, angle, and timing. Small jokes at too much paste and your crane swims away lighten instruction and reinforce lessons. Muscle memory, repetition, and quiet observation ensure knowledge transfer. The rhythm is patient and precise, reinforcing workshop culture. Evening firing begins. Wood is loaded, bellows managed, and airflow fine-tuned. Subtle timing and placement influence glaze, body shrinkage, and final tone. Historical note: reduction atmospheres were essential for signature celadon hues. Fringe story: poetic recitation sometimes accompanied firing, merging craft with narrative ritual. You watch the kiln respond to small adjustments, balancing intuition, science, and tradition. As the night deepens, minor faults are recorded, successes noted. Observations inform the next day's firing and workshop adjustments. Practical knowledge, intuition, and ritualized observation converge to form cumulative expertise. Sweeping conversation and careful organization conclude the day. Humor, ritual, and labor continue to weave a tapestry of craft continuity, quiet satisfaction, and human connection embedded in clay, fire, and shared work. You awake to the muted light of early morning, when dew hangs like fragile beads across the kiln yard. The workshop exhales with the quiet rhythms of daybreak, birdsong, soft scraping of tools, and faint smoke lingering from overnight fires. Historical note: Korean potters often began the day early, aligning work with natural humidity and temperature to optimize clay pliability. Fringe practice: some apprentices swore by silent morning rituals to greet the clay, believing it responded better to attentive hands. Scholars still argue whether these habits were practical or symbolic, but they shape how you move today. Hands sink into the pliable clay, kneading, wedging, and testing elasticity. Repetition reinforces muscle memory, while observation from the master ensures precision. You trim a bowl, noticing subtle variations in wall thickness and rim symmetry. Joke 1. Clay remembers your impatience. Joke 2. Lids are secretly judgmental. Joke 3. The wheel whispers truths your brain pretends to ignore. Humor keeps energy focused and morale intact. Inlay work demands heightened attention. You outline lotus petals, crane motifs, and clouds, preparing paste and embedding it with careful pressure. Historical fact: these designs conveyed symbolic meanings in ritual, domestic, and diplomatic contexts, giving the workshop both aesthetic and social significance. Fringe tale: whispering intentions while inlaying supposedly enhanced glaze outcome. You indulge the ritual, feeling it slow your hands and sharpen focus, blending ceremony with craft. Tea arrives as a quiet interlude. Steam curls into the air as apprentices converse softly about kiln behavior, drying, and market orders. Observations of temperature, moisture, and subtle glaze shifts inform decisions. Humor threads through dialogue. The kiln may judge, but tea forgives, someone quips. The pause resets mind and hands, offering both social bonding and operational calibration. Kiln preparation begins. Airflow, wood arrangement, and placement of pieces are meticulously adjusted. Historical point: reduction atmospheres control jade tones and glaze translucency. Fringe practice: juniper or pine sprigs sometimes accompany firing, blending superstition with subtle chemical influence. You watch flames, smoke, and embers, sensing the kiln as partner and puzzle. Apprentices rotate tasks: trimming, carving, slip application, and kiln tending. Observation, repetition, and hierarchy ensure knowledge transfer. Joke 1, water teaches better than any lecture. Joke 2, lids demand respect. Joke 3, misaligned tiles will haunt dreams. Humor softens rigor and reinforces cohesion. Inspection under fading light reveals moisture differences, warping, and subtle imperfections. Adjustments, rotation, repositioning, gentle handling preserve pieces for firing. Historical fact, controlled drying prevented cracking and maintained glaze integrity. Fringe practice, lunar rotation of pieces tied work to celestial rhythms. Scholars debate its efficacy, but value it as ritualized mindfulness. Teaching apprentices continues with demonstration and correction. You guide posture, angle, and timing. Jokes 2, much pace and your crane swims away and maintain levity and engagement. Knowledge embeds in muscle memory, repetition, and quiet observation, sustaining workshop continuity. Evening firing commences. Bellows, wood, and airflow are finely tuned. Subtle timing and placement affect glaze, shrinkage, and color. Historical point, reduction, atmosphere essential for signature jade tones. Fringe practice, poetic recitation accompanies firing. You observe the kiln, balancing intuition, science, and tradition. The day closes with minor fault logging, successes noted, and reflection. Practical knowledge, intuition, and ritual converge to shape cumulative expertise. Sweeping, soft conversation, and final tea round out the day. The workshop rests, hands relax, and clay, fire, and human attention linger in quiet balance. Humor, ritual, and labor have woven another day into the tapestry of skill and legacy. Wind down, as night stretches fully across the yard, you feel the workshop's rhythm settle into soft cadence. The kiln cools, smoke thins, and distant sounds of village life blend with gentle wind. Your hands bear impressions of clay, water, and subtle heat, each mark a trace of learning and care. The day's tasks dissolve into memory, technique, ritual, and quiet laughter blend into a calm awareness. You notice shadows lengthen slowly across drying racks, each piece standing as testament to patience and attentive craft. The moonlight kisses the edges of bowls and cups, highlighting curves and imperfections that tell human stories. Breath becomes slower, deeper, in sync with the nocturnal hush. You sense the quiet legacy embedded in the workshop, skill passed hand to hand, story to story, generation to generation, carried in shapes, glazes, and ritual gestures. The soft echo of bellows, faint tea aromas, and whispered instructions fade into a gentle lull. Your mind traces the arc of the day from early preparation to careful shaping, inlay, firing, and reflection, recognizing the slow cadence of mastery. The lesson lingers, craft is patience, observation, and attention, stitched together with quiet human presence. You release tension, letting thoughts settle. The yard sleeps, the kiln rests, and you drift with the gentle rhythm of work, history, and continuity. Tomorrow brings repetition, challenge, and quiet triumph, but for now everything is calm. Light fades softly from your vision, breath slows further, and the workshop's legacy hums in the space between thought and sleep. Let the quiet settle. Let the clay rest. Let the kiln's warmth linger only in memory, fading to a comforting hush as night deepens. You lift the raw lump like a slow animal. It is heavier than it looks. The clay smells of wet stone and river silt. When you squeeze it between thumb and forefinger, it yields with a quiet, slightly granular resistance, as if it remembers the last flood. Your nails pick up a faint line of dark grit. That grit will be sieved out. You knead the mass until its internal weather evens into a uniform patience. Clay has a first memory. You think that means it remembers the river tides and the seasons of sun and rain that shaped it. Clay for celadon is not an exotic ingredient. It is local earth shaped by water and time. Historically, Potters dug from river banks and alluvial flats near kiln towns because those deposits offer fine particles and predictable shrinking. They favored well-levigated clay with a moderate iron content. In reduction firing, that combination produces a body that supports a cool green glaze without clouding it. That is a tidy, useful fact to tuck into your pocket. The lump you hold was likely hauled from ground within a short cart ride of the kilns that fired it. You read the clay like a landscape. There are tiny pockets where sand once lay. There are stringy bits of root that must be pulled free by hand. Potters add time to clay the way bakers add rest to dough. They slate and sieve. They let the slurry settle until the water clarifies and the fine particles sink into a patient mud. They pour the clarified suspension through cloth and lick the cakes dry to a workable stiffness. The workshop smells of damp earth, warm wood, and the metallic tang of tools. Sometimes clay is aged for weeks in jars to smooth temperament and improve workability. You learn the terms by doing. Levigation means letting gravity and water sort particles. Grog is crushed. Previously fired clay added back to the body to control shrinkage and reduce cracking. Wedging is the bilateral knead that evens moisture and expels air. These words sit in your mouth like useful tools. One practical technical point belongs here. Adding grog reduces thermal stress and gives the clay a tooth, so the piece keeps its shape during throwing and drying. It matters when the kiln is unforgiving and the whole workshop depends on small, reliable margins. Testing clay is ritualized into routine. A potter pulls and shapes a small panel, dries it slowly to leather hard, and then fires it as a trial. The fired test chip is his oracle. He files it, grinds a bit, and rubs his thumb across the fracture to check the microstructure. He looks for a clean, dense break and for signs that the body vitrified evenly. These small experiments are as old as the craft, and they form the quiet backbone of reliable production. They are how a workshop keeps promises to markets and how apprentices graduate from guesswork to dependable judgment. Fringe stories gather around those tests, and they sit beside practical work. You remember from the kiln yard the moonlight exposures some families practiced because they believed lunar air refined surface tension. Here you hear another. One household insists that certain slips behave better when kneaded to the rhythm of a flute at dusk. A neighbor swears clay left in the shade for 3 nights after rain will dry without what they call wet nerves. An elder ties a strip of cloth around a fresh pile and murmurs a short blessing before a dig to keep the earth willing. These are not material science, but they shape rhythm and confidence in repetitive labor. Historians still argue whether the character of Goryeo celadon bodies was the product of deliberate material choice or a local geology that potters adapted into an aesthetic. The difference matters to museums and to the store makers in the yard. Was that translucent body an aesthetic ideal being searched for, or a fortunate local offering that potters learned to refine into an ideal? Standing beside the table you sense both realities. Geology sets a palette and skill sculpts meaning from it. You press the clay into a small testing cup and score the interior to test slip adhesion. The apprentice shows you the full technique to trap and expel bubbles. Your hands are clumsy at first. You repeat the motion until it becomes a slow, reliable choreography. The master's eye is neutral. He corrects a twist with a single small gesture. There is no scolding. The correction is precise, like tuning an instrument by ear. You begin to notice small margins that matter, a fraction of moisture here, a finer sieve there. Those marginal gains compound into consistent outcomes across a firing season. There is a social economy around clay. Families guard favored pits. Some deposits earn reputations for being fine-grained or for shrinking predictably. A pit might be called the little spring, because a trickle upstream keeps its deposit especially clean. Whole neighborhoods will prefer one body's paste for teacups and another for large jars. Dealers sometimes mix clays to balance plasticity and color. You imagine a 17th century potter bargaining over earth with the same seriousness a chef brings to choosing salt. Humor keeps long days bearable. You joke that if clay had social media it would post about being overworked and underfired. The apprentice calls your wedging a Yoba pose named buried duck. You laugh because craft language tilts toward tenderness. A third quip lands softer: when in doubt, add grog. When grog fails, blame the bellows. Each joke is a small social lubricant that keeps rhythm and mood steady. You learn to read clay as weather. A body that slumps too quickly will track steam and crack. A body that resists coalescing will betray your wheel. The trick is translation, not force. The master taps a wooden paddle against the base to firm it without hardening the walls. You copy his tap until muscle memory remembers before thought. By the time you rinse dirt from your nails, the lump on the table has become a cylinder with quiet promise. It still remembers the river, and it now remembers your thumbprints. You set it aside to stiffen, and you walk back to the kiln yard where the next slow tasks are waiting for you. You cup a fired shard and watch light swim across the surface. The green isn't simple paint. It is a conversation between iron, flame, and silence. That pale, misty jade you call celadon emerges when iron in the glaze is coaxed into a particular oxidation state during a reduction firing. The kiln's atmosphere decides whether iron reads as gray, brown, or that cool green that seems to hold light instead of reflecting it. Reduction means starving the fire of oxygen at key moments, so iron changes from Fetwo plus and Fe3 plus. You learn the basics by touching and tasting metaphors. A glaze first looks dull on the unfired bisque, like frost on a window. As heat climbs, the glaze begins to soften, gases escape, and surface tension smooths the microscopic texture into glass. At a certain temperature, the iron's electron state shifts and the color appears as if from nowhere. The effect is not a flat pigment. It is structural. Tiny crystals and networks within the glaze bend light in complex ways. You think of it as mineral thumbprint. Historically, Korean celadon achieved its most celebrated tones during the Goryeo dynasty, when workshops developed fine control of kiln atmosphere and iron-bearing glazes. That historical anchor matters because the Goryeo aesthetic prized a restrained, jade-like palette that echoed aristocratic tastes for subtlety and restraint. And yet the color also spoke across classes. A teacup hinted at verdant mountains and mournful poetry, whether it sat in a palace parlor or a provincial tea stall. You watch a demonstration. The potter mixes glaze from wood ash, clay, and a measured pinch of iron-rich earth. He warns not to overdo it. Too much iron pulls brown and muddles the jade. He tests on a small tile and sketches notes in the margin of a battered notebook. A practical note: the ratio of iron oxide to silica and alumina in the glaze will change how color reads. Silica makes glass. Alumina stabilizes it. Iron colors it. Patience and small adjustments are the daily research. Fringe practices crop up among workshops like mollusk shells on the shoreline. Some families once stirred tiny amounts of copper into test glazes, believing it would nudge turquoise into the green. Other ateliers experimented with bone ash or crushed shell to alter fluxing, convinced the mineral ghosts of animals would lend a different shine. These rituals are charming and probably ineffective in strict chemical terms, but they matter socially because they make the ritual of mixing feel like a ceremony. You find it charming. Historians still argue whether celadon's specific tonality was driven more by deliberate aesthetic philosophy or by serendipitous material conditions that potters then aestheticized. In other words, did potters seek jade consciously, or did the local clays and kiln practices produce a color that became desirable afterward? The debate colors museum narratives, and it changes how you read a glaze, as intention or as discovery. You hear an older master say something that lands like an aphorism: "Heat does not hurry." He flips the kiln door, and the smell of silt and wood falls outward. You note the scale of timing required. A reduction schedule is almost a choreography. The potter will bring the kiln up to a high point, and then throttle the oxygen by closing vents and adding green wood. The flame chokes in a controlled way, and the chemistry slides. Small temperature shifts of a few dozen degrees can mean the difference between a luminous celadon and a dull brown shard. A joke, if you try to shortcut the process with modern intent and a blowtorch. The kiln does not accept your hustle. Another joke: collectors will pay extra for a jar with what they call a munglo, which translates to "it cost more than your rent." You laugh because it's true. A third quip: in the market. Every glaze has a backstory. If it doesn't, make one up in a whisper and the buyer will likely buy it anyway. You study the surface under a loupe. You can see faint, feathery crazing where the glaze and body contract at different rates. Sometimes these micro cracks catch light and look like spider webs of silver. That's not always a flaw. It is another textural argument. A deliberate hairline network can make the green seem deeper by breaking the surface and giving the eye places to rest. You notice the tiny variations between shards from the same firing. One tile keeps a whisper of pale blue at its rim. Another carries a deeper pond green where the glaze pooled. These micro variations were once prized as signatures. Workshops learned to read them like fingerprints. Occasionally a workshop hit a perfect blend, and the resulting set of cups sold as if they had been married to luck. That idea of luck sits beside technique, and both get invited to tea. Chemistry aside, color carried meaning. The jade green associated with celadon evoked Confucian ideals of purity and restraint for scholars. It referenced jade itself, which in East Asia symbolized virtue, continuity, and connection to antiquity. A cup's color signaled the maker's skill and the owner's cultivated taste. That doesn't make every green pot a philosophical treatise, but it roots the color in cultural language. Techniques evolved as potters learned how iron behaved in their particular local clays and kilns. Some of those techniques disappeared and returned during revivals. Modern ceramists experiment with altered atmospheres, new ashes, and kiln building tricks to chase the same luminous tone. The result is a long conversation across centuries where chemistry and culture talk through glaze. You stand there thinking about how a simple change in oxygen can alter electrons and, by extension, a whole aesthetic. You like that it ties the smallest decision to the largest taste. The kiln's dark mouth seems less mystical and more like a stern collaborator. You sip your tea and feel the green hold a little light in its palm. You slide a needle across a leather-hard bowl, and the line answers like a quiet scene. Sangam is delicate work. You see the incised groove gather shadow, and then watch as a thin, contrasting paste is pushed in with a bamboo spatula until the groove is full. The idea feels modest. Cut a design, fill it, scrape the surface flat, and then let glaze close over the pattern so the design sits beneath the green like a secret. The technique is called sangam, and it became a hallmark of Korean celadon during the Goryeo dynasty 918–1392. Your hand trembles slightly the first time you try it. The groove accepts your line and rejects your bravado. Tool choice is intimate. You use a thin metal stylus for fine lines, a hooked bamboo tool for curves, and a blunt paddle when you need to push more paste into wide channels. Paste itself is simple: white slip for light inlay, iron-rich dark slip for contrast. The apprentice shows you how to hold the bowl at just the right angle so gravity helps the paste settle. The choreography is quiet and exact. There is a mainstream technical point to note. Sangam inlay uses slips whose particle sizes and shrinkage rates match the body. If they mismatch, the inlay cracks or flakes during drying and firing. That is a workshop truth that keeps boxes of test tiles on every bench. Tests are how tradition becomes repeatable practice. You admire the humility of this. Decades of small trials contain whole chapters of craft knowledge. Fringe memories hang on the edges of the technique. An elderly potter swears that the best inlays were made using paste kneaded to the rhythm of a certain hymn. Another claims that a family once used an underlayer of powdered shellfish to make whites sing brighter under glaze. These stories are not lab results. They are memory and charm. You remember the moonlight exposures from earlier and nod. Rituals recur. People like to think the world listens when you whisper to clay. Historians still argue whether Sangam was a purely indigenous innovation or whether it was inspired by contact with Chinese inlaid wares and neighboring crafts. The phrasing appears in catalogues and museum labels because it alters how we tell the craft's genealogy. For you in the workshop, the debate translates into small differences, whether certain motifs mimic external models or whether they signal a local visual language born from social practice. Design vocabulary is modest but rich. You see lotus scrolls, crane flights, auspicious cloud motifs, geometric borders, and sometimes narrative vignettes of daily life. Motif choice reveals audience. A court commission demands refined, symmetric motifs and restrained fields. A village pot for a wedding might carry exuberant cranes and misprints of luck. The hand that cuts a lotus touches an ancient grammar. You feel that grammar across fingers and time. There is a rhythm to a Sangam session. You incise for an hour, stop for tea, then fill for another. Filling requires a slow economy of paste. You push paste into a groove and then use the edge of a bamboo tongue to press and level. Scraping is the last micro movement. You perform it like a calligrapher finishing a final stroke. Sloppy scraps are saved. They become practice paste. Nothing useful is wasted here. The material ethic has a traditional wisdom. Conservation sharpens taste. Jokes soften the long work. You joke that if you insist on freehand motifs, you are legally obligated to include at least one accidental dragon. Another joke: inlay mistakes make for family legends and better auction descriptions. And a third: the apprentice will always mistake your deliberate asymmetry for incompetence until you point to a private code only masters understand. They laugh because craft humor is a sideways curriculum. You hold a finished piece before glazing. The inlay sits below the lip like a secret map. When glaze melts, it closes the seam, and the design seems to float. A technical aside, the glaze surface tension helps pull the inlay into optical unity so the image feels embedded rather than sitting on top. That interaction is the particular sorcery of Sangam. It is both art and applied physics. The social choreography matters as much as the physical. Inlay workshops have roles. One potter might specialize in composition, another in incision, a third in filling and scraping. This division of labor sharpens skill without splintering authorship. An expert eye inspects each tile before it is glazed. Standards matter because consistency sells. A set meant for a noble table must read as a single voice despite many hands. Fringe again, an older master keeps a small knick-knife that he swears once saved a whole commission because its particular burr matched a rare motif. You like that object because it is an example of accumulated luck, an instrument that holds a history of its own. The knife has a name that no one outside the workshop knows. Names, you realize, humanize tools. You test a finished inlaid shard under a loupe. The line edges read clean. The paste did not crack. You nod. The master nods back. There is pride, but no pretense. Work is visible in small certainties. You sip tea and remember how in the kiln yard a cracked bowl once became a monk's map. Here, a successful Sangam piece carries its own quiet map of hands, tests, and the small compromises that produced its surface. The debate over origins will continue in libraries and lecture halls. In the yard it translates into apprenticeship stories about an ancestor who invented a particular cloud motif. You like both kinds of story. They make the craft live in papers and in palms. You slip the finished bowl into the glazed queue and walk toward the kiln where heat will convert these secret maps into something that keeps light. You stand close enough to feel heat without being foolish about it. The kiln is a machine built from earth, brick, and a long habit of patience. Every firing reads like a long day condensed into hours. Fuel goes in. Air is coaxed. Temperature climbs. Flames walk through tunnel spaces and chamber mouths until the whole interior becomes a molten suggestion of what was once soft clay. Potters call it by practical names and by more lyrical ones. They measure by sight, by the sound of timber in flame, and by the way witness tiles report back after a long night. Kiln work is a social choreography. One person tends the fuel door. Another watches the pyrometric cones or feels the draft with a hand. Someone attends bellows, adding bursts of oxygen when the schedule requires it, then confines it to hush the flame so a reduction atmosphere can begin. This is not haphazard. It is a practiced choreography that turns a pile of wood and shaped clay into a finished, glass-covered object. Historically, successful celadon required long, carefully controlled reduction firings that sustained peak temperatures and low oxygen for extended periods to coax that jade tone. You learn to hear temperature. Wet wood makes a different note than seasoned charcoal. The kiln emits an almost musical palate, a low bass rumble when large timbers settle, a higher hiss as small kindling bites, a soft crackle when resins pop. Masters read those notes like sailors read wind. They test with combs and small witness tiles tucked into the kiln's heart. Those tiles are the kiln's report cards. You pry one loose later and read the result like an anxious parent. A practical point appears. Reduction firing alters iron's oxidation state at specific temperature bands. Maintaining a reducing atmosphere at peak temperatures is essential for that translucent green called celadon. Potters the just vents and feed schedules to manage oxygen. Small changes in timing or wood moisture will shift color and texture. That technical sensitivity made the kiln feel like a demanding colleague. You joke that if the kiln could speak it would complain about overtime. The kiln's structure matters. The way chambers are arranged, the slope of a tunnel, and the thickness of a hearth wall shape airflow and heat distribution. Workshops experimented with designs to get more uniform heat or to create intentional variation. Some kiln styles favored long tunnel-like combustion paths. Others used stacked chambers to let heat flow sequentially. Historians still argue whether particular chamber designs were local innovations or adaptations borrowed from neighbors. The debate soaks into how scholars read ruins and compare fragments. Fringe practices cluster at kiln mouths. Some families once threw handfuls of crushed shell into late firing phases, convinced it would kiss the glaze with a certain shimmer. Others placed a sprig of evergreen among the coals at the final hush, insisting the resin softened edges in a way fire alone could not. These gestures are more about ritual than controlled chemistry. They are small offerings, to an unpredictable process. You like them because they make the kiln less like a factory and more like a setting where people leave tiny, hopeful signatures. Firing schedules are strict and then not. A master might follow a written plan for feed and draft, but still change it on a hunch. That hunch is trained judgment. You watch a night shift where the bellows operator times her puffs with the master's whispered count. There is an intimacy to it. You imagine a choreography passed down the way songs are, through practice rather than print. The kiln rewards consistency and punishes haste. A joke arrives. Modern speed burners would be unemployed here. Failure is a frequent teacher. A sudden draft can cause a slump, a blister, a clouded glaze. A misread cone can result in a body that never reaches vitrification. Potters treat disasters like field notes. They recount them in the tea breaks and then keep the best shards as reminders. That scrap collection becomes a workshop's informal archive, a shameful and beloved museum of learning. One potter points to a blistered jar and says it taught him more than a year of successful firings. You laugh because craft humility is its own curriculum. There is a ritual about the last minutes. As the kiln nears peak and the master decides to begin reduction, small doors are eased and green wood is added to suffocate oxygen at variable rates. The visible flame behavior shifts, flames blacken, smoke thickens, and the interior breathes differently. That moment determines celadon's voice. It is both technical and theatrical. Tourists who peek at a late firing assume potters are performing secret magic. Potters nod and agree. They like that mystique because it protects hard work beneath a little mystery. You are allowed to help shovel a measured amount of wood under supervision. The work is quiet and honest. Your arms remember the rhythm. It feels like entering a long conversation with material time. Later, when you sip tea and the kiln hum continues in your chest, you understand why potters speak of an after-fire feeling a slow settling into the knowledge that you have done your best and that fire will now have its way. The kiln cools slowly. Heat lingers like a held breath. You will not open it until the temperature drops enough to avoid thermal shock. The wait is part of the craft's ethics. Patience protects labor. When the doors finally open, light and smoke spill out and the first smell is of caramelized ash and warmed clay. A rack is drawn. Pieces glint or flop. Triumph and disappointment sit on the same tray. You have been part of making that verdict. You leave the kiln mouth with a small chip of fired glaze in your palm. It is a physical note of the firing's mood. You tuck it into your pocket like a talisman. The yard returns to low talk and tea. The kiln's embers keep a slow, humming heat overnight. You walk home thinking that the kiln is less beast and more an expansive, temperamental instrument for listening. If pottery had HR policies, everyone would be required to take kiln safety seriously. You smile, tired in the best way. You sit down on a low bench and the midday light has softened to a comfortable gold. The teapot is small and unassuming. Steam unfurls like a slow exhale. Tea in the workshop is not performance. It is a scheduled, necessary interruption. You do not drink to impress. You drink to clear the dust from your chest, to steady hands, and to trade the day's small news. The tray carries 3 thin cups, a warmed kettle, and a small bowl with toasted grains or sweet persimmon slices. The movement is practiced. Your hand learns the arc of the pour in a single repetition. There is a clear historical point to tuck into your pocket. By the Joseon dynasty, Korean tea etiquette, known as darai, had been formalized enough that tea drinking became a recognized social ritual across classes, including artisans and scholars. That codification didn't make every teacup a ceremony, but it scaffolded what a tea break could be an ordered pause, a small civility. In workshops, tea breaks adopted Darai's calm pacing, but with plain speech and a tolerance for clay on one's sleeve. The sound of tea in the yard is gentle. Water boils in a metal pot and sings the different note than the kiln. The pot's whistle is a high finger pluck compared with the kiln's bass. Cup rims click as they are set down. Conversation slides between technique and gossip. Someone mentions a recent firing that produced a dramatic bloom of blue at the lip. Another recounts the monk who loved a cracked bowl. You remember that cracked bowl from the kiln yard. The story returns like a favorite refrain. Stories anchor mood as much as taste. Tea rituals shape the workshop's social economy. Midday pause is where tacit knowledge recipes for slips, a new bellows timing, a note about a temperamental patch of clay moves between hands. Apprentices sit beside masters and ask the questions that would feel intrusive during work. The tea makes hospitality allowable and technical exchange easy. You watch an exchange where a potter offers a small correction about glaze mixing only after the other's second cup is poured. The correction lands soft because the social currency of tea cushions critique. Fringe customs hitch on these moments. Some families avoid spilt tea, convinced it will invite kiln hiccups later. An old woman ties a single thread around the teapot handle before a big firing, claiming the thread keeps luck from running out. Another insists the tea steeped in a particular iron kettle produces a sharper memory for testing glazes. These practices are not chemistry. They are shared rituals that make uncertainty manageable. You indulge the superstition because it folds the workshop into a pattern, and patterns calm anxious hands. Historians still argue whether the ritualization of tea in artisan contexts was primarily an adoption from elite Darai or the result of independent, practical pauses that evolved within workshops. The distinction matters to scholars framing craft as derivative or as an autonomous space of culture. To you, sipping in the warm yard, the distinction feels academic and small. The cup is immediate and practical. The debate matters in dusty monographs. It's a footnote to your first sip. The sensory detail is decisive. Tea smells of toasted leaves and faint smoke. The cup is thin and warms your palm. Sound matters. The kettle's sigh, the scrape of a saucer, the soft laughter when someone tells a story, the laughter of people who have baked sweat into the clay and find humor easy. You notice subtleties, the way a hand trembles less after a cup, the steadiness that returns to shaping a rim. Tea is both reset and reward. Conversations at tea are both light and specific. One potter describes an inlay that refused to sit flush. Another suggests scoring more deeply and filling in smaller strokes. Trades include small, tested hacks how to dry a lid slowly to avoid doming, which ash produces a cleaner melt. You copy notes into your mental notebook and realize you have been learning at the edge of silence. The workshop's wisdom is a network of these small, repeated corrections. Humor is a steady seasoning. You joke that tea is the workshop's real quality control. Someone counters that tea is part of the firing schedule because no one can stoke a kiln on an empty stomach. Another quip, if you overdo one glaze, just call it an experimental series and it becomes avant-garde. The laughter is soft but frequent. The jokes remind you that play keeps craft human. A coworker smuggles in a small novelty, a folded paper charm from a market girl that promises a good sale if tied to a jar. The master tucks it under the kettle and nods. You recognize the charm as the same impulse that led families to whisper to clay before a dig. Superstition and pragmatic hope share the table. The boundary between ritual and habit is porous. You try extended tasting. The first sip is astringent, the second mellows into floral undertones, the third leaves a sweet ash note like a kiln's final hush. The pattern is meditative. Your breathing slows. You find that speech slides toward reflection. Topics broaden family weddings, the price of rice, a rumor that a merchant will pay better for palace grade cups next month. Merchants are a steady subject. Tea breaks are when you weigh the cost of materials against the calendar of orders. A small teaching moment appears. The master mentions that some teas pair better with certain glazes. He recommends a slightly smoky brew to test muted greens because it will not mask subtle iron tones. You experiment and find the trick sensible. Taste becomes tool supportive. The sensory scaffolding of tea helps calibrate eyes and hands. The practice quietly links palate and kiln in a feedback loop. You rest your cup on the tray and watch steam thread upward. The yard feels like a body breathing between tasks. The bellows will need to be tended later. For now, tea has done its work. You stand to return to your wheel with the steadiness of someone who has been given permission to continue. A final joke lands soft. If tea could be bottled, the workshop would have retired generations ago. You laugh and carry that warmth back to clay. You stand at the edge of the workbench and watch hands teach hands. The master does not raise his voice. He moves a finger along the lip, and your motion corrects itself before you can name the error. Apprentices learn by touch, by repeated small failures, and by the ritualized passing of tools. A historical note anchors this. Traditional Korean workshops favored long apprenticeships measured in years because the subtleties of throwing, trimming, and inlay require time under an experienced eye. Hierarchy is not merely about rank. It is a spoken code and an economy of care. The master holds the shop's reputation and its memory. He is the ledger keeper, the mediator with merchants, and the one who decides which pieces go to court and which go to market. Apprentices carry chores that make the craft possible: grinding slip, carrying clay, stoking the kiln, sweeping the yard, and learning to listen. Those chores are lessons in attention. You notice how small, repetitive tasks shape character and resolve as reliably as wet seasons shape river silt. You spend mornings polishing ribs until they gleam, and afternoons learning the wheel's exact resistance. The master times your sets and keeps a quiet tally. Praise is scarce. When it comes, it is a small bright thing that warms more than tea. Corrections are precise. Instead of saying wrong, he demonstrates once and returns you to the wheel. That economy of words trains you to watch rather than to speak. Joke 1. The master's most fearsome tool is not his blade but his silent stare. You laugh because the stare works faster than any reprimand. Apprenticeship is also about ritualized trust. A master may place a precious jar in your hands and expect you to cradle it as taught. The test is partly physical and partly ethical. Will you care for something fragile and expensive? Some masters require verbal oaths about secrecy of formulas and fidelity to the shop. A fringe story persists that certain ateliers required a midnight vigil beside the kiln to prove endurance and devotion. It sounds extreme and theatrical, but the vigil binds a trainee to a discipline that is equal parts skill and moral practice. Historians still argue whether workshop hierarchies reflected purely economic necessity or whether they encoded Confucian social ethics that shaped conduct across Korean crafts. The debate affects how we read the master's authority as managerial necessity or moral stewardship. You feel both when the master corrects you and when he refuses to sell a piece he calls unready. That refusal teaches integrity more than it protects profit. Hands tell stories. The master's palms are thick with calluses mapped by decades of work. An apprentice's hands are smoother, learning their first scars. The way a hand steadies a rib or flicks a trimming tool becomes grammar. You copy gestures until your body learns the pattern. Muscle memory files these lessons without drama. Later, when the kiln's report card arrives, your hands will know whether a glaze pulled well because they learned to sense the clay's tension months before. Joke 2, apprentices are paid in experience and occasional pastries. Joke 3, whoever invents a 3-hour wheel will be sainted by lazy potters. The jokes keep hierarchy human. They lubricate awkward moments and turn correction into an inside joke rather than humiliation. The pedagogical rhythm is slow and granular. Instruction happens in micro moments, how thumb rests on a lip, the pressure of a trimming tool at a particular angle, the exact timing for adding slip. The master sequences lessons. First you learn to listen, then to observe, then to imitate, and finally to innovate within rules. The invitation to innovate is subtle. A successful apprentice gets not only permission but the right tools at the right time. There is a political economy to skill. When a master retires or dies, workshops fragment or merge. Apprentices who have mastered signature techniques may open shops and compete. Competition can be friendly or bitter. A market rumor about a former apprentice's better glaze will travel fast and sting. The social ties of apprenticeship create a network of kinship and rivalry. Sometimes whole neighborhoods identify with a workshop's style the way a village supports a local team. Secrets and marks matter. Masters sometimes add hidden stamps under a base to claim authorship. A fringe practice includes burying a sliver of coin or a written wish under a kiln load as a private altar for luck. These gestures make production a human ledger of belief. You finger a small stamp under a pot and feel the intimacy of authorship. The cracked bowl story returns here as a touchstone. What looked like failure was revalued because someone loved the flaw and gave it meaning. Apprenticeship cultivates practical values, patience, respect for materials, fidelity to form, and a slow horizon for achievement. These are not romantic clichés. They are survival skills for a craft that punishes haste. You watch a young potter refuse a rushed commission rather than risk a batch that could betray the shop's long-term reputation. That decision feels conservative in the best sense, prioritizing craft continuity over immediate gain. Teaching is also reciprocal. Masters learn from apprentices who introduce new fuels, different kiln tricks, or fresh ideas spotted at distant markets. The best workshops conserve a core and adapt at the margins. You witness an apprentice suggest a small change to an inlay tool that reduces wrist strain. The master tries it, keeps it, and the shop gains quietly. That humility keeps the craft alive. Ceremonies punctuate lessons. When a workshop wins a court commission, the master lays out witness tiles, times a test feed, and the whole shop observes a moment of silence before loading the kiln. That gravity reminds you that craft is public work as well as private labor. You remember the moonlight exposures and small family rituals mentioned earlier. These practices bind production to social meaning and to a long memory. The day closes with the master walking the kiln yard with you. He points to a rim and says, "That was your hand today." It lands as credit and responsibility. You leave carrying both correction and encouragement. The master vanishes into dusk, and you return to your wheel steadier than an hour ago, fortified by the slow architecture of training. You bundle a crate with soft straw and tie it with a cord that has been reused until its fibers tell the town's history. You count the knots in the cord almost by habit. Finished ware moves out of the yard like a small, dignified migration. Jars slide into crates, bowls stack with paper between them, and a master signs off on the shipment with the same gravity he shows a court order. The path from kiln to market is as important as the making. Merchants, porters, and coastal winds participate in the piece's fate. A concrete fact holds. Celadon from kiln centers such as Gangjin on Korea's southwestern coast circulated widely during the Goryeo period and later. Workshops there produced large volumes destined not only for domestic markets but for regional trade. You hold that geographic fact like a map and let it shape how you think about every crate. The crate will touch roads, river barges, and coastal ships that run by sail and hope. Each hand that lifts it adds a margin of risk. Merchants are both practical and performative. They wrap a valuable cup in soft paper and also in a story. A merchant will whisper that a set came from a family line favored by the palace and watch buyers' faces soften. Sometimes the tale is true. Often it is commerce. Fringe practices embellish the packaging. Some sellers tuck a dried leaf or a scrap of poetry into parcels, convinced it improved sales by making buyers feel included in an intimate aesthetic world. You smile because you knew that trick already. You follow a small group to market day. The town smells of roasted barley, fish smoke, and leather. Market calls sound like a human weather system. A vendor hawks salted fish, a cloth merchant praises colorfast dye, a basket seller calls his weave fine as a scholar's eyebrow. Your crate is carried into a stall, where a merchant lays it out like a small exhibit. Bowls catch light, and the celadon's green breathes. Buyers press rims and test the weight. Your heart flutters because reputations are fragile. Trade routes are practical systems and expressive ones. Riverboats shuttle goods to larger coastal ports. From there, coastal schooners take cargo to regional markets in Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. The sea is an extension of workshop rhythm. It has tides, moods, and a temperamental engine of weather. You think about the kiln yard's patience and how it translates into packing crates that must survive waves. A joke lands: if pottery could swim, it would probably still complain about airline baggage fees. Historians still argue whether export demand shaped aesthetic choices in the workshops or whether local tastes primarily drove production and merchants merely adapted distributions. In market gossip, the debate condenses into practical questions. Did potters alter shapes to suit Japanese incense habits, or did Japanese buyers adopt Korean forms because they admired the green? The answer matters for how we tell lineage. For you on market day, the question is less theoretical. Someone will pay more for a hand-marked piece with convincing provenance. Ports develop economies of practice. A port official inspects crates, a clerk tallies tally sticks, and a broker negotiates freight. There is paperwork and there is improvised mercy. If a shipment is delayed by weather, a clerk may slip a note to the shipmaster for safe unloading. Sometimes bribery lubricates process. You keep your tongue in your cheek and your cord tight. A fringe rumor suggests merchants sometimes rubbed cargo with scent to hide kiln flaws. It could be truth or mischief. Market days create micro-economies. Coaches, laborers, and gossip networks meet. An itinerant connoisseur may show up to buy a matched set and then disappear with an envelope of cash. A joke: if a potter ever opens a supermarket stand, it would probably have an elite loyalty card. You watch a transaction where a merchant haggles over a tea set, argues ritual details, and then concedes because the buyer's face carries the right kind of reverent interest. Sales are social calibrations as much as price lists. Transport is risky and ritualized. Crates are labeled with a charcoal mark. Some merchants stamp their initials on the wood. There are superstitions about which coastal day is unlucky for sailing. Seamen avoid certain phases of the moon. Some sellers refuse to load on a day they consider ill-starred and postpone sale. You recall the moonlight exposure ritual and feel connected to these choices. Slowing the timetable by a day can mean a saved shipment. Fringe tales tell of lost cargo later found by a fisherman who sold it back at a profit. You watch the merchant roll a set into a cart and push it toward a river landing. Barges wait like slow beetles. Port workers load with practiced efficiency, balancing weight and fragility. They know exactly how many straw layers to add and where to place heavier jars to avoid pressure points. A joke: if you ever need to test human patience, ask a porter to balance art and pay. They will turn it into a proverb. Export marks become provements. A stamped base or a specific packing mark tells future curators where a piece traveled. Assemblages found in foreign ports later rewrite histories because archaeologists can trace distribution by where shards wash ashore. That practical archaeology is why your crate's label matters. A small charcoal token may determine whether a scholar notes an object as local or export. The stakes feel both grand and intimately petty. Market day ends with empty carts and lingering smells of tea. You count earnings in a book of squares and tally up what materials to buy for the next season. Profit is modest. Reputation is long. A final joke: potters do not retire rich, but they retire with very curated dishware. You walk home with the crate's empty straw and the soft certainty that your cups have begun their larger life among strangers who will name them in ways you can't predict. The palace is a different kind of kiln. It does not breathe heat but etiquette. You enter corridors where choices are watched and meanings multiply. Royal patronage shaped celadon as surely as fire did. In Goryeo times the court favored refined celadon for ritual vessels and diplomatic gifts, and workshops that secured palace commissions could rely on steady orders and prestige. That historical fact is a hinge. A court seal could turn a village atelier into a regional brand overnight. You feel the shift when a piece is described as palace grade. It becomes an argument about form. Plates flatten into restrained discs. Bowls adopt thin rims and modest curves that signal restraint. Handles shorten. Decorative fields shrink. The court's taste runs on a grammar of minimalism and measured harmony. The master explains that a royal set must answer precisely to a scholar's gaze and a minister's scrutiny. Production changes to meet that gaze. Apprentices learn new routines to meet tighter tolerance. Commissions arrive on official paper and sometimes with a court inspector who measures glaze tone against a sample. Workshops practiced a bureaucratic craft. They kept test tiles, feed logs, and records of wood sources used in successful firings. You help prepare a crate and feel pressure tighten. Tea breaks shorten and become strictly timed. The master's corrections turn clipped. You imagine the inspector's small, appraising smile as more dangerous than a kiln crashed because an order can be revoked for subtle variance. Political economy matters. A court commission grants favor, occasional tax relief, and a reliable distributor who handles risky coastal logistics. It also enforces visual conformity. The court's visual program can override folk innovation. Some masters accepted that trade-off. Others split production into two lines: a court line that kept to restraint and a market line that experimented with motifs. You learn to bifurcate labor and time, kiln cycles, so neither line suffers. Historians still argue whether court patronage suppressed regional experimentation or whether it created a high standard that raised overall quality. The debate influences museum narratives and how modern ceramists claim lineage. In the yard you hear both claims. An elder praises the court for elevating technical standards. A younger potter mourns playful glazes sidelined by formal commissions. Their argument is friendly and stings like a small ember. There are strange palace stories the yard repeats with a grin. One rumor says a minister demanded a cup in a ring to echo his jade belt because symmetry would flatter the king. Another whisper claims certain court ceramics were commissioned as coded diplomatic gifts and that motifs became discreet messages between envoys. These tales are likely apocryphal and entertaining. They make the court feel like a theater of meaning and nudge potters to imagine the political life of a rim or a crane motif. You make a test tile for palace use. The master mixes ash from a particular pine. he keeps for high-status glazes. He measures iron oxide by eye. He burns witness tiles mapped in a gradient so the inspector can choose a point on a spectrum rather than a single sample. Each tile is a negotiation: ash, iron, temperature, kiln atmosphere, and court taste. You lay out tiles like small arguments and then wait. The waiting is thin and exact. Workflows change under commission. One apprentice practices lids. Another sands hundreds of bases. The shop rehearses particular gestures until they become habits. Even small choices, such as how to stamp a base or which cord to tie on a crate, gain symbolic weight. You joke that you will never again underestimate the diplomatic value of a well-sanded foot ring. Another joke lands. The palace buys restraint and pays well enough that you can afford private experiments on the sly. A third joke goes, if pots could vote, they would always elect the kiln that provides free tea. Inspectors formalize standards. Their sample tiles get archived. Later generations consult them like legal precedent. Those archives stabilize tastes and make workshops converge on certain recipes. You wonder which parts of that legacy remain aesthetic and which are institutional inertia. The small irony appears: the system designed to ensure quality sometimes freezes practice and makes change slower. Masters balance respect for precedent with the need to keep edges from turning brittle. Commissioned pieces often enter ritual life. A set for ancestral rites demands different handling. You wrap those pieces with extra cloth and tie them with a knot that is precise and ritualized. The shipment resembles a miniature procession. The master says that certain glazes in ritual use are believed to invite ancestral attention. You file that as cultural meaning rather than chemical effect, but it alters how the shop treats a piece because ritual context demands reverence and care. Court ties can be precarious. Political shifts cancel orders or delegitimize workshops when patrons fall from favor. A previously favored atelier can become suspect overnight. That precariousness makes court connections both desirable and risky. You learn to keep a balanced client base because the kiln's best friend is diversification. The master teaches you to value steady village markets as much as golden palace commissions. At dusk you hold a palace graded bowl. It feels measured, cool, and a little distant. You recall the monk's cracked bowl and how value flips on human attachment. Court taste builds canons, but it cannot fully predict which objects become beloved. That unpredictability comforts you. It means there is always room for a bowl that sings its own quiet song despite decrees. You leave the palace crate under a lantern. The master exhales and the yard exhales with him. The kiln yard returns to routine, tea, repair, and slow talk. For tonight you carry both the pressure of orders and a small satisfaction. You learned to translate institutional demand into a shade that will be handled by hands more nervous than yours. That translation is skill, diplomacy, and the kiln's slow alchemy folded into one measured gesture.